Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I hope and trust that you are all well. Before I get started, I would like to give a very special shout out to the reformed members of Back to Ashes. Interscare Wifey, Tina Mead, Stephanie McLaren, Corpse Lover 450, Gwen Haley, Manna Ash, Normie DW, Christy Elias, Cindy Cleveland, Patty's Niece, and Samantha Place. The rest of the Back to Ashes membership can be seen right here on your screen. If you would like to become a member of Back to Ashes or would like to buy me a coffee as a thank you, all of that information can be found in the description below. Now, with all of that being said, it is time to go back to ashes, for when we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and happier person in the morning. Sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for this dose of vocal melatonin entitled True Crime Cases Volume 6. Right after this intro, an ad will play. I'll read the first case, another ad will play. After that, there will be no more ads within this video. Disclaimer: some of these cases contain information that may be sensitive to some. Listening discretion is highly advised. Armando Botel murdered a 17-year-old girl, Romina Fernandez, then set her body on fire. Armando Botel is behind bars for the murder of 17-year-old Romina Fernandez and setting her body on fire in Miami-Dade County, Florida. Romina was born in Uruguay, and by the time she was 2, she was living in Miami, Florida with her relatives. When she turned 9, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which required her to inject herself with insulin after every meal. In 2013, Romina was having complications from the disease and had to leave school because she was absent for far too many days. She attended Miami Killian Senior High School, according to the Miami Herald. While at home, Romina was studying to take the GED test as well as looking for a job. Her dream was to work in the beauty industry. It all changed on October 10, 2014, when Romina didn't return to her home in Little Abner Mobile Home Park in Sweetwater, leaving her medication behind. At around 6:20 p.m., she called her friends and said she was no longer able to be their friend because she was going to move to New York with a man. Romina spoke to her friends in Spanish, something she wouldn't normally do. According to her mother, Romina, quote, spoke perfect English and perfect Spanish, but she spoke to her friends in English and to family in Spanish. That has to have some significance, end quote. She then sent the following letter to her mother in the mail, quote, "Hi Mom, I'm okay. I'm moving to New York with a friend. He bought me food and my medicine. Don't worry, I'll call you in a month," end quote. Quote, "Something about that message just wasn't right," end quote, said Romina's mother. Quote, "I knew something was wrong," end quote. On October 11, 2014, Romina was reported missing. At around 9:15 p.m. that night, law enforcement was called to the strip mall at Flagler Street and 114th Avenue after receiving calls about a fire. Officers arrived on the scene and went to the back of the building. That's when they noticed an object on the ground that was engulfed in flames. When firefighters extinguished the fire, they realized it was a body that had been, quote, burned to a charred crisp, end quote, said Sweetwater Captain Jorge Fernandez de Lara. The body was later identified through dental records as that of Romina. Quote, "She was always smiling. If she was going through something, she never showed it," end quote, said the teen's mother. An autopsy revealed that Romina had been strangled. In May 2015, police officials arrested Botel, who was 66 years old at the time he was booked into the Miami-Dade County Jail on charges of second-degree murder. He was held without bond. Investigators said Botel and Romina knew each other. According to the police report, quote, he, Botel, had been selling and providing the victim with Xanax and other drugs since the victim was 15 years old. The relationship developed into an intimate and stalking relationship to the point that the defendant became obsessed with the victim, eventually paying a friend to follow the victim around, end quote. A witness told police that Botel, quote, was becoming emotionally distraught over his obsession with the victim, and he became physically abusive, end quote. There were also nude photos of Romina that were found on Botel's phone, police said. It was learned through an investigation that, on the day of Romina's disappearance, she met up with Botel in downtown Miami at around 2:30 a.m. They then went to Sweetwater, where he lived, as her cell phone pinged off towers that were close to Botel's home. But investigators are unsure if he kidnapped her or if she went to his home on her own. According to Police Lieutenant John Jenkins, surveillance footage from the mall captured the moment someone exited a silver Mercedes-Benz and discarded Romina's body near the dumpster. They then set it on fire before fleeing the scene. Jenkins stated that the vehicle was registered to Botel, who had served time in prison for a murder conviction in 1980. He had been questioned multiple times within 7 months, and police said, quote, his story didn't add up, end quote. Quote, based on the cell phone tower records and based on witness information, his story had changed, at which time he was arrested and charged accordingly, end quote, said Jenkins. In July 2019, Botel took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to murdering Romina and mutilating her corpse. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison with credit for the time he had already served. Upon his release, Botel will have to undergo 2 years of community-controlled electronic monitoring, and he will also be placed on probation for 8 years. Botel's attorney said, quote, he is very sorry and very remorseful about what happened, and it's a tragedy for the family of Romina, the victim, end quote. Prison records show that he is serving his time at the Jefferson Correctional Institution in Monticello, Florida, and he is scheduled to be released in 2027. Dominic Mays killed his estranged wife, Amber Owens, whose body was found in a ditch. Dominic Mays is behind bars for killing his estranged wife, Amber Owens, whose body was found in a ditch in Montgomery County, Ohio. In the summer of 2014, Owens moved out of the home she shared with her husband and moved in with her grandparents on Elm Grove Drive in Harrison Township. She also took her daughter with her, as well as the 2 boys she had with Mays. According to the Dayton Daily News, Mays and Owens had a volatile relationship. He was arrested and charged with felony domestic violence in 2013, and Owens had a temporary protection order against him. Since he is not indicted by a grand jury, the charges were dropped. On October 21, 2014, Owens went missing. She told a relative she was going to the convenience store to purchase diapers and milk for her children, but she never returned. She didn't show up for work at Waffle House either. Owens' relatives filed a missing persons report 3 days later, which prompted a search by law enforcement and relatives. Quote, she has a full-time job, she's a mother of 3, and she's very family-oriented, end quote, said Madge Darrell Wilson of the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Quote, and this is definitely not in her character, end quote. On November 4th, authorities found Owens' vehicle abandoned on Arlene Avenue in Dayton. At around 2 p.m. on December 4, 2014, Owens was found dead. Montgomery County road crews found her decomposed body in a ditch along Post Town Road in Trotwood. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office identified Owens through fingerprints. She was 23 years old at the time of her death, which detectives were investigating as a homicide. It was reported that Owens' relatives immediately believed that Mays had something to do with her death because of the type of relationship they had. They also stated that when they were out looking for Owens, he was not involved in the search. Mays denied the allegations. In an interview, he stated that although he and his estranged wife had a volatile relationship, he did not harm her. He also mentioned that he didn't help search for her because he didn't get along with Owens' family. Quote, I know I love my wife, and I know she loved me. I have no reason to kill her. Why would I kill her and spend the rest of my life in prison? End quote, Mays said. On December 12th, Owens was laid to rest. Her funeral service was held at the Ethan Temple Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 4000 block of Shiloh Springs Road. Hundreds of people were in attendance, including Mays, who sat in the front of the church with a son in his lap. According to WHIO-TV7, Owens' family asked him to not attend the funeral, but he showed up anyway. And when he did, they did not ask him to leave. In April 2015, the Montgomery Prosecutor's Office announced that Mays had been arrested in connection with Owens' disappearance and death. He was charged with murder, involuntary manslaughter, felonious assault, abduction, domestic violence, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. Mays was booked into the Montgomery County Jail, where he was held on a $1 million bond. The details surrounding Owens' cause of death will not be released to the public following a plea deal Mays made with prosecutors. He also avoided a trial. Quote, I personally did not want to go through the trial. It would have been so devastating with all the elements and details, end quote, said the woman who raised Owens. On June 15, 2016, Mays was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, felonious assault, abduction, gross abuse of a corpse, and several other charges. Mays was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Phil Palmer, the Montgomery County Sheriff, released the following statement. Quote, the Sheriff's Office is pleased with the sentencing of Dominic Mays. This was a cold, calculated murder where he left 3 young children growing up without their mother. I would like to thank both the sheriff's detectives as well as the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office for their hard work on this senseless murder, end quote. Mays is serving his sentence at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Scioto County, Ohio. Tomanoe Tawala killed 19-year-old Nelia Ann Scanlon following an altercation outside a bar. Tomanoe Tawala is behind bars for killing 19-year-old Nelia Ann Scanlon following a verbal altercation outside a bar in Honolulu, Hawaii. In the early hours of August 7, 2021, Tawala got into an argument with a group of people outside the Imua Lounge Bar on Keamoku Street, according to the Samoa News. Tawala, who was reportedly 29 years old at the time, got into her SUV and drove over the crowd, running over Scanlon and a then 31-year-old woman in the parking lot. Both women were pinned underneath the vehicle. Firefighters with the Honolulu Fire Department were called to the scene, where they had to use the jaws of life to lift the vehicle off the victims. Scanlon, the mother of a then 3-year-old boy, was rushed to the emergency room of an area hospital, where she was listed in critical condition. She died from her injuries the following day. The second victim was also taken to the hospital with serious injuries, but she survived. Tawala was arrested at a parking lot nearby and booked into the county jail, where she was held on a $300,000 bond. She was charged with 1 count of attempted second-degree murder. Following Scanlon's death, the Department of the Prosecuting Attorney announced that Tawala's charges would be amended to second-degree murder pending the medical examiner's investigation. Tawala was later indicted on those charges by an Oahu grand jury. On August 30, 2022, Tawala admitted to recklessly killing Scanlon, and she also pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of 1 count of manslaughter. The following year, in January 2023, Tawala was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Quote, I am very pleased with Judge Salza's sentence in this case. What started as a fistfight between 2 people turned into a deadly situation due to Tawala's actions. And Honolulu streets will now be safe from her dangerous behavior. Although nothing can bring back Nelia Scanlon, I hope that this sentence brings some comfort and closure to her family, end quote, said prosecutor attorney Steve Alm. Caution, this next story may be uncomfortable for some. Listening discretion is highly advised. Sean Grell murdered his 2-year-old daughter, Kristen Salem, when he doused her with gasoline and set her on fire. Sean Grell is behind bars for murdering his 2-year-old daughter, Kristen Salem, by burning her alive in a remote location in Apache Junction, Arizona. On December 2, 1999, Grell, of Phoenix, purchased a 32-ounce beer before he went to Kristen's preschool to pick her up because he said he wanted to take her to see Christmas lights in Mesa. When they got there, Grell stopped to get food at McDonald's. They ate in the car while it was parked in a parking lot at an apartment complex. That's also when Grell, who was 24 years old at the time, said he drank his beer. He then drove around town and showed Kristen Christmas lights. But after a while, she started to get cranky, and she kept asking for her mother, Amber Lee Salem. Grell became agitated. Then he slapped the toddler in the mouth. She stopped crying a few moments later and said, quote, "Sorry, Daddy," end quote. He said she was okay for a while, then, quote, "she just went nuts," end quote, and started asking for her mother again. That's when he drove to Target at Southern Avenue and Gilbert Road and purchased a red 3-gallon gasoline jug. Grell filled it up with gas at a gas station at Broadway and Gilbert Roads, then drove around for 45 minutes before coming to a stop at a drainage ditch in a deserted area in Apache Junction. It was about 15 feet from the roadway. Kristen was asleep, but she woke up when he pulled her out of the car and put her in the ditch. Grell then poured gasoline, and it was during that time that she reportedly said, quote, "No, Daddy, no," end quote. But that didn't stop him from lighting a match and hurling it in her direction, setting his daughter ablaze. Kristen was on fire when she took a few steps, then fell face down in the dirt. She took a few steps before falling face down in the dirt. Quote, "I couldn't even look at her. I just had to get in the car and go," end quote, Grell said. Grell drove back and forth on a nearby road, watching the flames. When the fire went out, he drove back to the crime scene to see if Kristen was dead. And she was. He then left the area and drove to a convenience store, where he purchased more beer. As he was checking out, he told the store clerk that he saw a group of kids setting a dog on fire in a nearby desert. He said, quote, "I can't believe that kids would set a dog on fire. This is what the world is coming to when kids set dogs on fire," end quote. On December 3, 1999, Kristen, whose mother reported her missing the previous day, was found dead in the ditch. An autopsy showed that Kristen died from burns and smoke inhalation. She also sustained 3rd and 4th degree burns over 98% of her body. Her feet were the only part of her body that wasn't burned, according to the medical examiner. Grell later walked into the police station and confessed to murdering his daughter, and he didn't have a reason for doing what he did. Sergeant Dave Tromby, a Maricopa County Sheriff's spokesman, said, quote, "He basically said he didn't know why he did it. We looked at the obvious things like domestic relations and problems, but there were no indications as to domestic problems," end quote. According to the Arizona Republic, Grell became angry after getting fired from his job 2 days before the murder. Apparently, the company found out about his criminal record and decided to let him go, just like in his previous jobs. Grell was arrested and booked into the county jail on charges of first-degree murder. Following a short bench trial in July 2001, Grell was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. Grell told the court that he accepted the death penalty. He also apologized to Kristen's family for intentionally killing his daughter. He said, quote, "I'm extremely sorry for what I did to my daughter. There is not a day that's gone by where I haven't thought about it. I wish I could take back what I did," end quote. His defense attorneys claim that he should not be put to death because he suffers from, quote, "severe brain dysfunction," end quote. According to ABC 15, as a result of his disability, when he was a child, he was, quote, "placed in a group home for mentally changed children for 5 years," end quote. A judge overturned Grell's death sentence in 2013 and reduced it to life in prison after it was determined that he was mentally disabled and could not be put to death for that reason. According to the East Valley Tribune, quote, "The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it would be constitutionally prohibited, cruel, and unusual punishment to execute someone with mental retardation," end quote. In May 2013, Kristen's mother passed away in her sleep. She is now buried next to her daughter at the Greenwood Memory Lawn Cemetery in Phoenix, Arizona. Julia Birch murdered her 92-year-old roommate, Nancy Ann Frankel, then called 911 to report it. Julia Birch is behind bars for murdering her elderly roommate, Nancy Ann Frankel, whom she attacked inside their home in Montgomery County, Maryland, and then called 911 to report it. At 8:20 a.m. on July 28, 2021, officers and emergency responders were called to Birch and Frankel's home on Spruill Drive in Kingston for a death investigation. When they arrived, Birch confessed to killing Frankel, according to Montgomery Community Media. Responding officers found the 92-year-old's body in her bedroom, and it appeared to have been staged. Birch said she wanted it to look, quote, "presentable," end quote. She tried to lay Franklin on her bed, but was unable to because of the weight of her body. Birch then left Frankel on the floor and sprayed perfume on her body, folded her arms across her chest, and placed a pillow beneath her head. Officers transported Birch to the Montgomery County Police Headquarters for questioning after they found evidence at the scene that corroborated her story. The then 26-year-old told detectives that she initially tried to suffocate Frankel by putting a bag over her head, but she poked a hole in it. That's when Birch strangled her to death on the floor. Birch and Frankel met through their families, who worked at the Catholic Workers Movement. In January of that same year, Birch decided to move into the house where Frankel had lived for 50 years because she didn't want her to be alone. She also paid rent. Frankel's son said, quote, "We were worried because my mom was by herself in the house, and so we actually thought it was great for her to have somebody living there in case she fell or hurt herself. Now, obviously, you can second guess it, but it really seemed like the perfect thing for her at that time," end quote. He also mentioned that he thought Birch, quote, "seemed like a really lovely person. She seemed very sweet, and I can't believe anyone would have done that to my mom. So it's like a complete shock," end quote. An autopsy later confirmed that Frankel died of asphyxiation. She was an award-winning sculptor from Washington and had also earned her bachelor's degree from the Tyler School of Fine Arts at Temple University in Philadelphia. One of her neighbors described her as a wonderful person who would often display her artwork in the yard. After the incident, Birch underwent a medical evaluation. It was then that she was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, according to the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. Her doctor determined that at the time of the killing, she was having, quote, "psychotic symptoms," end quote, but said she, quote, "still understood murder was wrong and could control her conduct to conform to law," end quote. Birch was arrested and booked into the Montgomery County Jail on charges of first-degree murder. She was held without bond. On March 20, 2023, Birch pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. That same year, a judge sentenced Birch to 40 years in prison, but 17 years was suspended. When she is released, she will be placed on supervised probation. Birch will then have to complete 240 hours of community service. The motive behind the killing remains unclear. Jorge Dupree-Lachazo murdered an elderly woman, Evelyn Smith Udell, after delivering and installing her washer and dryer set. Jorge Dupree-Lachazo, a former delivery driver, is behind bars for the murder of Evelyn Smith Udell, also known as Evie, when he bludgeoned and set on fire at her home in Boca Raton, Florida. On the morning of August 20th, 2019, Lachazo and his co-worker arrived at Udell's home in the Colonnades at Glen Oaks community on Northwest 49th Street. They were there to deliver the washer and dryer she had purchased from Best Buy. Lachazo, a then 21-year-old who lived in an apartment in Hialeah, was working for JB Home Delivery. It was a company that was contracted by Best Buy to deliver their appliances, according to CBS 12. After they installed the washer and dryer set, the coworker stepped outside to return several missed calls, while Lachazo stayed behind to speak with Udell, 75, about her new appliances. It wasn't long before the coworker heard a woman screaming. When he ran back inside the house, he saw Udell on the floor with blood on her head, and she had been set on fire. He immediately called 911 for help. During that time, Lachazo was in the delivery truck trying to turn it on, but he was having a difficult time because he didn't know how to drive. When he got the vehicle started, he fled the scene. A responding officer saw Lachazo driving away from Udell's home and immediately pulled him over. It was then that he admitted to the officer that he struck Udell on the head with a rubber mallet, which he retrieved from the top of her washing machine. He then went to the garage, got a chemical, doused her with it, and that's when he said it, quote, spontaneously combusted, end quote. Lachazo also mentioned that he had taken cocaine and marijuana earlier that day. In the officer's report, he wrote that Lachazo was, quote, very sweaty and was shaking, as if he was very nervous, end quote. Lachazo told the officer that he was a bad person and he wanted to die. He said, quote, use that pistol already. Use it already. Disappear me, end quote. Before Lachazo was taken into custody, the officer searched him and found $203 in his pocket. Lachazo was arrested and booked into the Palm Beach County Jail on charges of second-degree attempted murder, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon on a person over 65, and arson. He was held without bond. According to the Palm Beach Post, when Boca Raton Fire Rescue arrived at Udell's home, they noticed that the dryer was running and the burners on the stove as well as the oven were turned on. When they went into the laundry room, they found Udell alive, but she had been beaten beyond recognition. Her head was covered in blood and her clothes were engulfed in flames. She was sitting upright, leaning against her washer and dryer, and next to her was a single-dollar bill that was reportedly burning in flames. Her wallet was nearby, and it looked as if it had been rummaged through. Officers believe that the money found on Lachazo's person belonged to Udell after his co-worker confirmed that he wouldn't have received that amount of a tip in one day. Evidence suggested that theft was the motive for the violent attack on Udell, police said. After firefighters extinguished the fire, Udell was rushed to an area hospital where she was listed in critical condition. The following day, she succumbed to her injuries. Lachazo's attempted murder charge was amended to first-degree murder. Udell graduated from Penn State University, where she met her husband of 55 years and began her career as a librarian at LaSalle University and Gwinnett Mercy College in Pennsylvania. When she wanted to be closer to her children and grandchildren, Udell moved to Florida and began working as a librarian at Florida Atlantic University in 2003. She retired more than 15 years later. When FAU learned about her passing, they released the following statement, quote, Evelyn will be remembered as a kind, caring, and hardworking member of the staff. The university is devastated to hear about Evelyn's passing. We send our deepest condolences to her family, friends, and former colleagues, end quote. Out of respect for Udell, Best Buy shut down their Boca Raton store for 24 hours and ended their contract with the company that Lachazo was working with. During an investigation, Lachazo told detectives that he killed Udell because the voices in his head told him to do so. He claimed it said, quote, kill her now or else, end quote. He later changed his story and said the murder was carried out so that he could steal her money. Lachazo said he needed money because a group of extortionists were after him. During a 3-day bench trial, which was approved by the Palm Beach County Courts on January 6, 2023, Assistant State Attorney Reed Scott argued that neither voices nor extortionists caused the death of Udell. He said it was, quote, greed and an attempt to take money, take more money, take all the money, end quote. Investigators found his fingerprints on the mallet as well as the chemical bottle that was used to set Udell on fire. Therefore, the defense attorneys didn't deny the fact that Lachazo had murdered Udell, but they argued that he didn't plan to kill her. On August 25, 2023, Lachazo was found guilty of first-degree murder, burglary, and arson. He was acquitted of the robbery with a weapon charge. In April of that same year, Lachazo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He received an additional 30 years for arson. All right, dear listeners, the next few cases were audience requested. Are we ready? Here we go. Upon actually trying to find the real story of Gore Orphanage Road, this is all I could find that made sense to read, so please enjoy. The Legend of Gore Orphanage Road, Vermilion, Ohio. If you take a trip to Lorain County, Ohio, you might come upon a road where the ghostly cries of children echo amongst the trees. According to legend, these children were victims of a crazed man, giving the nearby road the name Gore Orphanage Road. But did the legend actually happen? Gore Orphanage. In the early 1900s, Mr. Gore and his wife built an orphanage on an isolated road surrounded by woods. As the orphanage filled up with children, the Gores had no clue they had a neighbor living alone in the woods who preferred his quiet isolation. No one in the nearby town knew anything about the man, except that he would randomly be seen yelling at seemingly no one prior to the orphanage being built. Once the orphanage was complete, the man turned his attention to it. Often he would yell toward it, complaining about the noisy children, but as the years went on, the Gores saw him as harmless. In 1923, the man reached his boiling point. One night, he yelled and cursed the children, wishing it had never been built. As usual, the Gores ignored him and tended to the children instead. But that would be a terrible mistake. Around midnight, as everyone in the orphanage slept, the man returned, barricaded the doors, and lit the orphanage on fire. According to the legends, the man watched as the entire orphanage was engulfed in flames, and the terrified cries of children would then slowly die out. Following this, the man was never seen or heard from again. As a way to honor the dead, the town renamed the road nearby Gore Orphanage Road. Many came by to pay their respects, but soon those visiting started to hear the ghostly cries of children coming from the remains of the building. Word started to spread, and as more people traveled to Gore Orphanage Road to investigate, many witnessed the ghosts of those children running around. Other times, they heard the same desperate cries from the night they burned alive echoing through the trees. Other versions. There are a lot of different versions of the story, but here are some of the more popular variations. In one version, the owner of the orphanage, Mr. Gore, was unmarried and known as Old Man Gore. Instead of the loving caretaker from the version above, here he was a terrible brute who was often heard yelling at the children. One night the children angered him to such an extent he decided to burn it all down and collect on the insurance money. Another version of the story claims the fire started by complete accident caused by one of the children accidentally tipping over a candle, though this version doesn't explain how the children weren't able to escape the fire. Finally, another popular variation blames the janitor of the orphanage for the fire, claiming he left the boiler on for too long, which caused it to ignite. Again, this version doesn't explain why none of the children tried to escape the fire. But did it happen? Despite the popularity of this legend throughout the decades, including a movie in 2015, the story of a Gore orphanage burning down is entirely false. In reality, Gore Orphanage Road was originally called Gore Road, and the Gore was not in reference to the surname of the local orphanage owner. When mapping out a piece of land, several surveyors will map it according to different pre-established maps and land patents. If any of these contained an error, or if any of the surveyors made an error when writing down measurements, this could result in a small piece of land that is unincorporated called a Gore. Gore Road was given its name because it passed through one of these pieces of land. The Real Orphanage. In 1902, Reverend John, or Johann, Sprunger and his wife, Katie Sprunger, opened an orphanage in the area called the Light of Hope Orphanage. During the time it was open, the road was renamed Gore Orphanage Road. While there were no reported deaths at the orphanage, the 90 to 100 children were treated so poorly that several ran away in the 13 years it was open. The children complained of being beaten by Sprunger, forced to sleep in rat-infested beds, not given enough food, rented out as labor to other farmers nearby, and forced to eat food prepared in the same water used to clean their dirty clothes. An investigation into Light of Hope Orphanage found some of these claims were true, but since the state of Ohio, at the time, didn't have any power in governing orphanages, nothing could really be done. The bad publicity did cause many to pull children out of the orphanage, and 2 years after the investigation, John Sprunger passed away, causing financial turmoil. Around 1915, the orphanage closed for good. The Real Haunted House. Though the land the orphanage was built upon belonged to Sprunger, there was one mansion on the land called the Swift Mansion that Sprunger did not use. Constructed in the 1840s by Joseph Swift, he eventually sold it off to Nicholas Wilbur and his family. Like many families in the late 19th century, the Wilburs were into spiritualism and seances. There were rumors that Wilbur's children were psychic and, when performing seances, they were able to communicate with the ghosts of dead children. In 1901, Nicholas Wilbur passed away and the home was abandoned. Almost immediately, rumors that it was haunted were passed around. Many claimed the ghosts of Nichols' grandchildren, who died of diphtheria epidemic, were some of the ghosts seen there because they supposedly died there. In reality, none of the Nichols grandchildren died at that home. But because Wilbur was known to perform seances that invited ghosts into his home, many believed the house was haunted and many visited the home hoping to see a ghost. In 1923, the home burned down, thought to be caused by some visitors hoping to see a ghost. Today, the remains of Swift Mansion are what many believe are the remains of Gore Orphanage. In the end, the legend of Gore Orphanage is just a mixture of several stories blended together to create a terrifying tale, one that never happened. Sarah Boone, the suitcase murder. Red flags waved non-stop on France Lane in Winter Park, Florida. Sadly, nobody paid attention. If Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. had called it quits, he'd probably still be alive. And Boone wouldn't be sitting in an Orange County jail cell awaiting trial for second-degree murder. Instead, on February 23, 2020, Torres suffocated inside of a suitcase, crying out for help while Boone jeered drunkenly. She captured the moment on 2 cell phone videos. Her boyfriend's autopsy would show that he spent 11 hours zipped inside the luggage and died of asphyxiation. Boone called 911 around 1 p.m. the next afternoon, saying, quote, "My boyfriend and I were playing last night, and I put him in the suitcase when we were playing a hide-and-seek kind of thing," end quote. In the arrest affidavit, she says she fell asleep and didn't realize Torres was still in the suitcase when she woke up a few hours later at about 11 a.m. She claims she unzipped the suitcase and found Torres unresponsive and not breathing. She phoned her ex-husband, who urged her to call 911. However, 2 videos on her phone show that she intentionally left him in the suitcase despite his pleas for release. Quote, "That's my name, don't wear it out," end quote. She slurs as he pleads for release. Alcohol played a role in their tumultuous 3-year relationship. Court documents reveal a history of violence between the couple, both 42 at the time of the fatal incident. They each had previous arrests for battering one another. In July 2018, Boone faced charges of domestic battery by strangulation. She and Torres had been living together for a year and a half at that time. Boone told investigators that Torres became enraged when she spoke to another man at a bar. When they got home, Torres dragged her upstairs and kicked her in the right eye, she said. Research identifies strangulation as a key risk factor in the eventual murder of the victim in the relationship. According to the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, victims are 10 times more likely to be murdered by someone who choked them. Torres had a different story. He told investigators Boone tried to strangle him. He said he had to kick her off to stay alive. Deputies were unable to identify the primary aggressor. They charged Torres with battery and Boone with aggravated battery with strangulation. The couple refused to press charges against one another. They both posted bond and the case was eventually dropped. In June 2019, Torres was accused of striking Boone on at least 2 occasions. Once, the police responded to a domestic violence call at the couple's home. Boone said Torres hit her on the head, face, legs, and arms. He was angry because she spoke to another man. She claimed he threatened her life. Quote, "You're going to die," end quote, he allegedly said. Boone refused medical treatment but filed out a domestic violence worksheet. Law enforcement arrested Torres and took him to jail. Boone testified against him at his court hearing. The judge granted Torres' release from jail on the condition that he abstain from alcohol and drugs. He also had to maintain a separate residence from Boone. He couldn't or wouldn't do so. In September 2019, law enforcement arrested Torres for violating his bond terms. According to the criminal complaint, he kicked open Boone's bedroom door while she was asleep and punched her in the head. Following these incidents, they wound up living together again. The red flags waved, but nobody listened. Boone's trial began November 7, 2022, but it was postponed until March 31st, in which a pretrial conference was held, with the trial initially scheduled to begin on April 10th. The trial is now scheduled to begin on July 24, 2023. It is unclear why the trial has been delayed. Inside the horrifying mystery of the Bear Brook murders and the evidence that points to the chameleon killer. Between 1985 and 2000, 4 bodies were found crammed into barrels in the woods of Allenstown, New Hampshire, and authorities believe they are victims of the chameleon killer, Terry Rasmussen. The case stumped investigators for years. 4 bodies found dismembered, skeletonized, wrapped in plastic bags, and stuffed into 2 55-gallon steel drums in the Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. And for years, no one could put a name to them, instead referring to the Bear Brook murders. Curiously, the first drum was way back in 1985, and the second wasn't discovered until the year 2000. But there was no doubt the killings had been the handiwork of the same person. But, as it turned out, that person had been several different people throughout his life. Known at times as Curtis Kimball, others as Larry Banner, and frequently as Bob Evans. The killer's true name was revealed as Terry Rasmussen in 2017, 7 years after his death. Yet, they still had no clue who the victims were. 3 of the victims would be identified, however, 2 years later, thanks to the obsessive amateur sleuthing of Rebecca Heath and Barbara Ray Benter. The identity of the 4th victim still remains a mystery. This is the twisted story of Bear Brook murders. 4 bodies are discovered in Bear Brook State Park, 15 years apart. On November 10, 1985, a hunter trekking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, came across a large industrial steel drum. Inside, he found two bodies, dismembered, wrapped in plastic bags and highly skeletonized, beyond recognition, Oxygen reported. It was determined that they had been killed sometime between 1977 and 1985. The bodies were eventually buried in a nearby cemetery with a tombstone that read, quote, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care," end quote. The case had gone ice cold. Then, 15 years later, on May 9th, 2000, a second 55-gallon drum was discovered in the same area. How investigators had missed it over a decade prior remains unclear, but the second barrel, like the first one, contained the mutated bodies of two young girls, stored in the same manner. This new discovery didn't offer any immediate clues as to who the killer had been, though. The bodies were certainly killed around the same time as the first two, but with no way to identify them and lacking any other insight, the investigation once again reached a dead end. It would take 17 years until the killer would be named, and another 2 until his victims would be identified. In 2017, using genetic genealogy techniques, investigators were finally able to name their man, Terry Rasmussen, an inmate who had died 7 years earlier in 2010 while serving a sentence for the murder of his then-girlfriend, Yoonsun Jun. It wasn't Rasmussen's first time in prison, however. He'd just been using a different name. As the Los Angeles Times reported, Rasmussen had spent time in jail in the early 1990s for theft under the name Robert Evans. Before that, he'd been jailed in 1988 for driving a stolen vehicle under the name Jerry Mockerman, and even earlier in 1985 for drunk driving and child endangerment. He later abandoned that child, whom he had pretended to father and called Lisa, in a trailer park. After his stint in the 1990s, Rasmussen stayed off authorities' radar for a little over a decade. By 2001, Rasmussen was working odd jobs in California under yet another alias, Lawrence Banner. He had an, quote, unofficial backyard marriage ceremony, end quote, to Yoonsun Jun in Richmond that same year, though no marriage certificates were ever filed. A year later, Jun's body was found dismembered and buried in her basement. Curiously, against the advice of his attorneys, Banner pleaded guilty to the murder during his trial. Authorities were able to link him then, using his fingerprints, to the earlier child abandonment case. Testing his DNA, they also determined that the man had not, in fact, been Lisa's father, and an investigation began to find out who Lisa really was. Lisa sent a sample of her DNA to an ancestry website and learned her mother's name, Denise Beuden. And Denise only had one daughter, whom she had named Dawn. Beuden and Dawn, an infant at the time, had gone missing from their home in Manchester, New Hampshire, just after Thanksgiving in 1983. They had been living with a man named Bob Evans. By 2017, Bob Evans was dead, and investigators believe he had killed Denise Beuden after they left New Hampshire. There were still many questions to be answered and gaps in Evans' history to fill in, but now investigators had a crucial piece of evidence. Bob Evans, or Lawrence Banner, now lived in New Hampshire in the mid-1980s. DNA evidence then connected the man officially identified as Terry Rasmussen to the bodies found in Bear Brook. One of the victims had been his daughter. Quote, "We believe we have our killer," end quote, said New Hampshire Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelzin at the time. Quote, "Now we need to identify and try to find all of his victims," end quote. The amateur sleuths who solved the Bear Brook murders. In October 2018, the New Hampshire Public Radio released a podcast called Bear Brook, which explored the bizarre, unique case. Investigators knew who their killer was, but they still had no clue who the victims were. The podcast had reignited interest in the case and captured the attention of a 34-year-old librarian from Connecticut named Becky Heath. In her free time, Heath began scouring the internet for any clues she could find. Quote, "I got a little crazy with it. I would go to work and I'd come home and I would just research and research and research," end quote, she said. Online, she found a post from someone who mentioned the name Sarah McWaters. The poster claimed to be McWaters' half-sister. Replies were filled with other people who also believed they were related to Sarah, one member of a family of 3 who had gone missing sometime in the late 1970s. The family was comprised of Sarah McWaters, an infant, her older sister Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and their mother, Marlise Honeychurch. Heath continued researching, messaging some of the family members who had been around at the time when another name came up, Terry Rasmussen. Apparently, Honeychurch had been with Rasmussen the last time she was seen. Quote, "I was like, there is no way. There is no way that's a coincidence. This is huge," end quote, Heath said. At the same time, Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist, independently used the victims' DNA to identify them in a cutting-edge technology that required using autosomal DNA, which is found inside the cell nucleus. It had previously been thought impossible to recover autosomal DNA from hair strands that were no longer attached to the root. But a forensic lab in California had been working on a new method to reassemble that broken autosomal DNA found in rootless hair. After months of trial and error, Ray Venter was able to use this method to identify the victims. Heath submitted her tip to authorities in October of 2018. The victims were officially named in June 2019. Now, the only question that remains is, who was the middle child, Terry Rasmussen's daughter and 4th victim? All right, dear listeners, this is where I bring an end to these True Crime Cases Volume 6. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you kindly. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed some of these cases. Until next time, please take care of yourself. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good night.